By the early 1980s, TSR, the company Gygax had co-founded in a basement in Lake Geneva, had grown into something enormous. What had started as a niche publisher of box sets for hobbyists had now ballooned into a pop culture force. Fueled by the explosive success of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons and a surging interest in fantasy media, products flew off the shelves. Dice sales skyrocketed. Gygax, for a time, was a household name, at least in the kind of households where the kids drew dungeon maps in the margins of their math homework, like myself. And yet, behind the walls of TSR's newly acquired mansion-like headquarters in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, things were far from stable. By 1983, TSR was bursting at the seams, not just with staff, but with product lines, internal departments, and growing debt. Rapid expansion had brought with it a tangled web of management layers and ballooning overhead. New divisions were launched with optimism, if not oversight. Toy development, book publishing, a needlepoint line, even a venture into Las Vegas shows. And while some of these gambits briefly glittered, many fizzled, draining time, money, and attention away from the company's core strength: games. Once the visionary at the helm, Gygax now found himself a world away from the tables where the magic first happened. As president of TSR, he was buried under memos, meetings, and marketing pitches. Increasingly, the day-to-day creative work, scripting adventures, designing modules, dreaming up dragons, was handed off to others. Gygax still loomed large over the brand, his name emblazoned on every Dungeon Master guide and player's handbook, but inside the company, his grip was slipping. The stakes at this point could not have been higher. D&D had grown from a hobbyist oddity into the backbone of a burgeoning industry. Millions of players were crafting characters, battling beholders, and rolling dice in basements and bookstores around the world. TSR wasn't just a company, it was the steward of a cultural movement. But under the weight of internal conflict, unchecked spending, and an increasingly splintered leadership structure, the company was headed straight for a reckoning. And Gary Gygax, the man who had helped spark it all, was about to be pushed out of the castle he had built. This chapter of the story isn't just about financial statements or hostile boardroom votes. It's about the shifting tides of power, the cost of ambition, and what happens when a game built on collaboration becomes a battlefield for control. The next few years would define the fate of TSR and reshape the legacy of the man who once rolled one of the very first initiatives. Welcome to Dice, Dungeons, and Dreamers. Today is all about the ousting of Gary Gygax. For a moment, it really was magic. By the late 1970s, D&D had become more than a game. It was a cultural undercurrent, a quiet revolution spreading from kitchen tables and school libraries to hobby shops and conventions across America. TSR, the company co-founded by Gary Gygax and Don Kay, was riding the crest of that wave, fueled by wild imagination, word-of-mouth evangelicism, and the kind of passion that only comes from people doing something they genuinely love. This was the golden age, and like many golden ages, it looked perfect, right up until it didn't. The core of D&D's success in those early years came down to timing and audacity. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons AD&D hit shelves in waves. The Monster Manual in 1977, the Player's Handbook in 1978, and the Dungeon Master's Guide in 1979. Each one thick with rules, lore, and art that would set the tone for decades of fantasy gaming. The books were flying off the shelves. Shops could not restock fast enough to meet demand. Players were hungry for more, and TSR was eager to feed them. New modules, glossy magazines, dice sets, miniatures, even coloring books and lunchboxes made appearance. To outsiders, it looked like TSR could do no wrong. They were hiring fast, expanding faster, and becoming a touchstone for a new form of entertainment, one that encouraged collaboration, imagination, and a touch of geeky rebellion. But behind the scene, things were already beginning to buckle. You see, TSR was never just a game company. Not really. It was a passion project that had accidentally become a business. And while Gary Gygax was a genius when it came to game mechanics, high fantasy world building, and convoluted random encounter tables, he wasn't a businessman, not in the traditional sense. He had charisma, no question. He could talk for hours about campaign design or the superiority of percentile dice, but budgets, cost projections, inventory control, not so much. Gygax was more comfortable crafting celestial hierarchy of demons than reviewing a profit and loss statement. That left the messy, unromantic work of actually running the company to others, namely the growing board of directors and executive team, including the increasingly influential Bloom brothers, Brian and Kevin. Now, the Blooms weren't exactly villains, at least not at first. Brian had come on board in the first days of D&D with a personal investment that helped TSR get the first box sets into gamers' hands. Kevin joined later, a complicated passing of Don K's shares, who was one of the original investors but died tragically in 1975. But both brothers quickly became fixtures in the company's upper echelons. They understood that TSR had potential. What they couldn't agree on, especially with Gygax, was how to manage it. By 1982, TSR had grown at a breakneck pace. They moved out of their modest digs into a sprawling headquarters on Sheridan Springs Road in Lake Geneva. They weren't just making D&D books anymore. They were multiple departments now, each with its own staff, licensing, toys, fiction publishing, art direction, and more. TSR launched board games, card games, and even plans for a D&D themed amusement park. At one point, they were producing nearly a dozen different product lines simultaneously. It was impressive. It was ambitious. It was also very expensive. And as Shakespeare says, there's the rub. TSR's finances, like many of its products, were held together with hope, duct tape, and a bit of dice rolling. The company rarely had a firm grip on cash flow, and accounting was more reactive than strategic. Projects were greenlit with enthusiasm, but without sufficient marketing researching or budgeting. Production costs ballooned, warehousing costs spiraled. The company was top-heavy with executives, many of whom had titles that sounded important but didn't contribute much to the bottom line. At one point, internal documents reportedly listed over 60 vice presidents. Let that sink in. 60. Then there was the Satanic Panic, a subject which I will cover in more detail in my next episode. But suffice it to say, media outlets, conservative religious groups, and even law enforcement began to associate D&D with devil worship, suicide, and occultism, which forced TSR into having to play defense, not just from competitors, but from the public at large. The company tried to pivot. They scrubbed overly dramatic demonic references from new publications. They stopped using the term devil in later printings. They launched PR efforts, but the damage was done. Some parents banned the game, schools cracked down, and while TSR's products still sold well among the faithful mainstream, partnerships grew harder to secure. All of this, the bloated executive structure, the scattershot business ventures, the cultural backlash, was slowly eroding the foundation beneath TSR's golden facade. Sales remained strong in absolute terms, but profit margins were shrinking. Warehouses were overstocked with unsold products. Employee turnover increased. Internal morale plummeted. And through it all, Gygax remained focused not on balance sheets, but on books, both writing them and increasingly escaping into them. And it was at this turbulent time that Gygax moved to Hollywood, trying to push D&D into television and film. He co-founded TSR Entertainment, leased an expensive house in Beverly Hills, and lived like a king. To his credit, the Dungeons & Dragons cartoons did make it to air in 1983, but his extravagant spending and physical and mental absence from TSR's headquarters was noticed by more than just the middle managers. The Blooms, now firmly entrenched in the executive structure, began to position themselves for greater control. From their point of view, Gygax was out of touch, distracted, and unsuited to lead a company of TSR's size. They weren't wrong, though whether they were right for the jobs themselves is a matter of debate. What was clear, however, was this: TSR was at the tipping point. The golden age had become tarnished with overreach, missed opportunities, and boardroom rivalries, and the company that had helped birth an entire genre was in crisis. And the man who had guided it there, Gary Gygax, was about to face the greatest challenge of his professional life. A power struggle was coming. The dice had already been cast. It's a cliche that no one expects the knife in the back to come from their own table. But in the halls of TSR, where dice rolled like thunder and dragons were slain on paper daily, the most dangerous encounters were happening in the boardroom. By the early 80s, the Blooms had climbed high enough within the company structure. Brian had served as vice president and later president, and Kevin had taken on operational responsibilities. Gygax, by contrast, had drifted further from the day-to-day mechanics of the business. He was still a creative force, still a titan in the gaming industry, but he wasn't watching the books. And the Blooms, they were, very closely. The relationship between Gygax and the Blooms had always been uneasy, but by 1983, things had started to sour in earnest. Brian and Kevin were frustrated with Gygax's frequent absences and his tendency to greenlight projects based on creative intuition rather than financial reality. Gygax, in turn, viewed the Blooms as meddlesome, too focused on profit margins, and uninterested in the spirit of the game. In other words, they were businessmen. He was a storyteller, and the company needed both, but couldn't seem to balance either. Gygax had big dreams for D&D. He got a cartoon deal with CBS, complete with toy tie-ins, and a live-action screenplay was in development, all of which, from a creative standpoint, was thrilling. But him being physically away from TSR headquarters from a leadership standpoint was disaster. With Gygax in California, the Blooms had free rein to steer the company, and they didn't hesitate. They expanded the executive ranks, they pushed through costly initiatives, they diversified into new product lines with questionable profitability. Internal records suggest the company was, at one point, putting out over 24 different game products annually, many of which never found a market. But behind the whirlwind of expansions, TSR's finances were unraveling. Overhead was ballooning, and even with the cartoon sales, everything was flattening. And in 1984, Gygax was called back to Lake Geneva. The reason? Panic. TSR was in financial freefall. The company had posted a staggering loss of $1.5 million in 1984 alone. When Gygax returned, he found the company he helped build practically unrecognizable. It was bloated, disorganized, and teetering on the edge of collapse. He immediately began taking steps to regain control, firing employees, halting projects, and seeking new investors. But it was too late. Unbeknownst to Gygax, the Bloom brothers had made a fateful move. They quietly sold their shares to a woman named Lorraine Williams, a publishing executive whose families had ties to the Buck Rogers intellectual property. Lorraine had business acumen, a commanding presence, and most importantly, the votes. With the shares she'd acquired from the balloon, she now held a controlling interest in TSR. Gygax was stunned. He tried to fight it, attempting to rally support from the board, but the numbers didn't lie. Lorraine Williams was now the majority shareholder, and by October of 1985, Gary Gygax was out, forced to resign from the very company he had founded more than a decade earlier. He would later say bitterly that he had been betrayed by people he had trusted, that he had left the company in good faith and returned to find himself sidelined. In interviews, he lamented how the focus had shifted from creative innovation to corporate control. I quote, "I was forced out by the machinations of people who cared more about profit than product," he once said. TSR stopped being about the game. Williams, for her part, took the reins with a firm hand. She implemented sweeping organizational changes, reduced overhead, and streamlined product lines. Under her leadership, TSR would stabilize financially, but would also become infamous for a more corporate, less community-friendly approach. Remind you of anything? Many in the hobbyist world would come to view her tenure as cold and disconnected, even as it arguably saved the company from collapse. But that's a story for another chapter. For now, it's enough to say that the boardroom coup wasn't dramatic in the traditional sense. There was no shouting match. There was no sword fight across the conference table. It was a legal maneuver, a transfer of shares, a quiet signature that ended an era. And so the man who had helped bring dragons to life on graph paper, who had turned basements into battlefields and friends into adventurers, walked away from the castle he built. His name still on the box, but no longer on the door. The age of Gygax was over, and the reign of Lorraine had begun. When the storm passed and the dust settled in the boardroom, Gary Gygax was no longer at the helm of the company that he had co-founded, championed, and some might say bled for. The coup had been bloodless in a literal sense, but for Gygax, it was a gut punch. A betrayal wrapped in boardroom politicking, signed off with corporate pens rather than crossed swords. At first, Gygax didn't go quietly. In true adventure fashion, he tried to mount a comeback. After all, he still held a seat on TSR's board, and he hadn't entirely given up hope for regaining control. There was public statements, some defiant, some diplomatic. In a 1985 interview, he asserted that, quote, he was very much still involved with TSR and downplayed any rumors of hostility. But behind closed doors, things fractured fast. Gygax attempted to rally support among the shareholders. He questioned the legality of the Bloom Brothers stock sale to Lorraine Williams. He considered lawsuits. He spoke with reporters. He told friends that he had been undermined while doing what he thought was best for the brand. But the reality was undeniable. Lorraine Williams held the majority shares now, and she wasn't budging. Eventually, Gygax faced the truth with a grim sort of resignation. The fight was over. Only 2 months after he had stepped down as CEO in December of 1985, he resigned from TSR officially and completely. But Gygax wasn't one to retreat quietly into obscurity. Within months, he launched a new company, New Infinities Productions, Inc. It was meant to be his next act, a place where he could write and design freely, unencumbered by corporate constraints or shareholder squabbles. His flagship product, Dangerous Journeys, was an ambitious, rules-heavy RPG that aimed to be a more advanced alternative to D&D. Sadly, the title would become bitterly ironic. TSR sued him almost immediately, claiming it infringed on D&D's mechanics and branding. The legal battle dragged on until Gygax eventually settled and agreed to shelve the game. Still, he pressed on, later developing another RPG called Legendary Adventure. It never reached the heights of Dungeons & Dragons, but it represented something more personal. Gygax's refusal to give up the dream. He continued to attend conventions, give interviews, and connect with fans. He never stopped being the guy who helped invent D&D, even if the company had tried to move on without him. Meanwhile, back at TSR, the boardroom didn't stay quiet for long. After the stock sale that gave Lorraine Williams control, the Bloom brothers found themselves increasingly marginalized. Despite orchestrating the coup that ousted Gygax, they were now seen as liabilities. TSR's financial health had deteriorated under their stewardship, and Williams, practically and business-minded and unencumbered by nostalgic loyalty, wasn't going to let that slide. By the end of 1986, both Bloom brothers were gone. Their grand play for control had resulted in temporary reign and a swift fall. Karma, I guess. With the Blooms out and Gygax gone, Lorraine Williams took full command of TSR. Her arrival marked a sea of change, both culturally and creatively. Unlike Gygax, who had cut his teeth in the wargaming trenches and wrote rules like sacred scripture, Williams came from a publishing background. She had a sharp eye for structure, budgets, and deadlines, but little interest in the gaming community or its quirks. To many inside TSR and to much of the fan base, Williams was a mystery. She kept her distance from the convention circuit, rarely gave interviews, and preferred polished press releases over spontaneous fan engagement. This wasn't just a new chapter for TSR, this was a whole different look. Under her leadership, the company tightened up its operations. The wild experimentation of the early 80s was reined in. Product lines were streamlined. TSR made moves into novel publishing, licensing, and the burgeoning world of branded merchandise. On paper, it looked like a professionalization of the brand. In some ways it was, but there was a cost. Creatively, something was slipping. The mid to late 1980s saw a decline in the innovation that once made Dungeons & Dragons a revolution in gaming. Modules became more formulaic. Rulebooks grew heavier but not necessarily deeper. The sense of wild invention that had once pulsed through TSR's veins was fading, replaced by a cautious corporate approach to content. Fans noticed, and so did competitors. Other RPGs like Call of Cthulhu, Shadowrun, and GURPS were offering players something fresh, something weird, and something dangerous. And while D&D still ruled the genre in sheer name recognition, the throne was beginning to wobble. TSR's dominance no longer felt unshakable. For longtime players and fans, it was a strange and bittersweet time. The game they loved was still alive, but not quite the same. The face on the convention banners had changed, the voices behind the rulebooks were different, and the man who had once invited them all into the world of dragons and dungeons, he was off somewhere else, building new worlds no one would ever hear about in quite the same way. In the years to come, TSR would stumble again and eventually fall. But the aftermath of Gygax's ousting set the tone for everything that followed. A shift from wild invention to corporate caution, from personal passion to professional polish. And through it all, the players kept rolling dice, telling stories, and building worlds. Because even when the creators were cast aside, the idea of the game lives on. I touched on this briefly, but the next episode will be about the satanic panic of the 1980s that aimed to take the moral high road to D&D and remove it from the landscape entirely. I actually debated about which I should do first. Not only do they happen at around the same time, but they sort of feed into one another in a sense. But make no mistake, the satanic panic of 1980s definitely threatened the life of D&D just as much as all these corporate wranglings. Not just D&D either. although the game was always the main target, but also a lot of pop culture that defines the 80s for us now. We'll get into all this in the next episode of this series about the wild history of D&D. So be sure to subscribe so you can get notified when that gets published on YouTube. And until next time, may all your rolls be nat 20s.